Good afternoon, everyone. We will take one more minute to let people trickle in, and we are going to get started right away. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. We are going to be focusing on best practices to cultivate a purpose-driven nonprofit board of directors. Today we have Kendra Snipe from OD Design joining us today. She has created an amazing deck, an amazing presentation filled with information, best practices, resources, templates, all for you to get your board of directors going in the right direction. And we are so fortunate and excited to have her here today with us. But before I turn it over to her, a few housekeeping details. So this webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded to the Aparo website. All of you who are attending today will receive a follow-up email from me that includes the link to the recording, but also a copy of the slide deck and any resources we might talk about today. Down here is what your toolbar should look like. Feel free to use the chat to make any comments, questions. The Q&A is also available for you to use questions. We will monitor both and address those questions at the end of her presentation. Also, if you'd like to use closed captioning, that is available for you to use as well. So Aparo is a nonprofit that helps other nonprofits with any technology needs and challenges. And we use this model here to support that mission where we connect nonprofits with skilled volunteers and corporations in the areas of advice, education, and solutions as it relates to technology so that we can help you amplify your impact in the communities that you serve. So like I said, the buckets of services are advice, education, solutions. Our advice service is at no cost to you, where we connect you with a tech therapist one-on-one to go over your technology need, get coaching on any tech challenges you might have, get guidance on resources, or if you're looking for a vetted vendor, we have a lot of great connections that we can connect you with. Under education, we offer team trainings that are tailored to the needs of your nonprofit staff, as well as these nonprofit bites and insights. And under our solutions are our larger projects. So we connect you with a team of volunteers to help you find a solution to address your technology need. An example of that might be if you're looking for a software application. We know it can be a very difficult process to go through yourself, so we're here to support you with that. And then something I do want to mention, our Aparo grant program called Mission Possible is going to be kicking off early next year. This is where one lucky nonprofit is going to get $10,000 and consulting support to make your technology dream come true. There are eligibility requirements, so I recommend that you take a look at the website. I will drop the link in the chat in a moment. I also recommend, if you are interested, to attend the program kickoff and information session that is slated for January 13th. And then finally, we are talking about board of directors. So if you happen to be looking for a board member with technology background, we might be able to facilitate a connection. If this is something you're interested in, I will be dropping a link to a form for you to complete to be put on our interest list. And then finally, these are the different ways you can stay connected with us at Aparo. If or when you are interested in our services, the best way is to go onto our website and fill out our request form, and someone will get in contact with you. And then also, if you like what we do, please consider writing a short Google review for us. That is it for me. I'm going to be dropping the links in the chat, and then I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Kendra.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I was telling you earlier how excited I am to be facilitating this workshop or this webinar. There is a lot of information, but I am going to do my very best to make sure I keep it surface level, but you should be able to walk away with quite a bit of information. I'm going to share my screen. And Yinting, you tell me if I am good to go.
I can see it. You're good to go.
All right. So this webinar is titled Best Practices to Cultivate a Purpose-Driven Board of Directors. Let's get started by talking about what our takeaways are. So we're going to talk about the board roles and responsibilities, identifying clear goals, how to determine board structure, running an effective board meeting, and then we're going to move into what purpose-driven leadership actually is. And then I'd like to end by just providing you with some additional resources. I wanted you to know that I took 100% effort into building a deck that included all of the questions and comments and just things that you all wanted to know, because I'm not doing this just for me, but I am creating something that you need, that you've asked for. So when the question was posed before you were, this happened while you were actually signing up for the webinar, do you have a purpose-driven board of directors? Maybe this was kind of a trick question because I don't know if you made your own definition or you're in line with what I had in mind as far as what a purpose-driven board of directors, what that means. So 8 of you said no, 5 of you said yes, and 13 of you did not take the bait and said, I'm unsure. So with that, the next question I asked was, how are you defining your board in terms of diversity? Like, what does the makeup look like? And there were quite a few answers. These were just a few that I kind of pulled out. No diversity at all, it's good. Black-led, less than ideal. Moderately diverse, only diverse women and men. Good from a gender standpoint, but not so much as it relates to ethnicity, age, and ability. I thought that was very important because a lot of times we overlook ability. And then when I asked the question about governance, here are some of the things that all of these things should be covered. But running an effective board, what does good governance look like? Who's responsible for the things that happen as a part of the board? What does a tight agenda look like? And board engagement. A lot of those things came up. I saw that quite a bit when it comes to how do I keep my board engaged? What do I do? That seems to be quite a challenge, and that came out quite a bit. So, and also separation of duties. So I've tried to be creative during this process. I am actually going to call out some of the questions right before I get to a certain part in the presentation. I'm going to say, for the person who asked this particular question, pay attention at this point in the presentation because it should really answer those questions. All right, so let's move on. Where I'd like to begin is talking about the legal responsibilities of nonprofit board members. So you need to know that as a member of a board, if you're leading a board or you're a member, that's a huge responsibility. And there are legal implications if using that role, if you're not using the role correctly. Hence, there are 3 headlines that I thought I would share with you. First, before I even talk about that, let's talk about the 3 areas of legal responsibilities. So we have a duty of care, a duty of loyalty, and a duty of obedience when we are in board leadership positions. Here are some headlines that came across the news. Qualcomm's corporate board sued for lack of diversity, failure to appoint Black directors. Serious about nonprofit boards getting serious. 2 boards sued for misuse of assets. Minnesota nonprofit food program under federal investigation. So that's not the type of a platform we want. We want to be on the front news, the front page of our local newspaper for good things. We want to make sure that we are crossing our T's and dotting our I's so that this is not where we will land ourselves. So I do appreciate you all attending this webinar, because this is going to provide you with the tools that you need to stay away from negative publicity. Let's move on into, I don't want to assume that people should know exactly what each role looks like, what this means, and how you should go about. So what I did was I started from the very beginning. What is a board of directors? A board of directors, we're supposed to create directional guidance so that the nonprofit can live up to its mission. So these are 4 positions that make up the executive committee. So the chair is responsible for the functioning of the board, making sure that you're facilitating the meetings, overseeing the work of the committees, and you work very, very closely with the executive director or the CEO of the nonprofit. Then you have the vice chair, who's basically the understudy to the chair. So this person would assist with all of the functioning of the board and serves as an advisor and a deputy to the chair. So in the event that the chair cannot step up for whatever reason, you should have been in such great sync with your vice chair that they should be able to step up and continue carrying on the responsibilities even in your stead. So the secretary supports the board as far as the organizational needs. They make sure that the minutes are kept. You want to make sure that what's happening is something that's consistently documented. They also help to keep the board on track with the strategic plan. So we'll talk more about that. And they're also making sure that the bylaws are followed to the letter. The treasurer is more on the fiscal side of the house. They're responsible for overseeing the assets and liabilities so that the organization does not operate at a loss or spend too much. So they also work with the executive director and the CEO as well, just to make sure that they're forecasting that annual budget in which the entire board has to approve. So the questions that I received at the beginning: who's responsible for holding the board responsible? And another question was, how do you ensure separation of duties? I can't make it more clear than this. Everyone who's on the board has a responsibility. And I'm going to dive even more into that because I talked about the executive committee, but there's also individual contributing board members who, if they're not holding an executive committee role, well, what happens to them? Well, committees is where they would come into play. So we have your typical standing committees. These are permanent. These are the you're regularly meeting and discussing the business of the board. So that would be the finance committee, then you have the governance, and then perhaps your programs committee. And these are just examples. You could have more committees depending on what you're doing. You could have more standing committees, that is. But then when we talk about ad hoc committees, these are based on when you need to have something for a short period of time. These are like annual planning meetings for special events, strategic planning, like there's something that happens with your board, like if you have a signature event that happens every year. That would be considered an ad hoc committee who comes together, they do all the planning, they execute the event, and then they kind of go quiet until the next time for them to come back together. So once you pass the standing committees, once you get to the ad hoc, and then we'll talk about advisory and steering committees, this is when you can start bringing people from the community to have a seat and participate in some of the things that your organization is directly influencing. As members of the community, they have that advantage. And it's important to have those ears and eyes as part of your planning as well. So with that said, talking more about the advisory and steering committees, these are usually people who have a really good rapport in the community. They're well respected. They have their ear to the ground. They know what's happening. They are hearing from community members what they are or are not receiving from organizations who have that nonprofit status. And they're there to help study the challenges. They're there to like guide you, the board, and the executive director through the process of what's happening that's right and what can we take a second look at. And from all of these discussions, they can provide recommendations. So you can have a standing advisory committee where you meet once a quarter, you can meet like once every couple months. It really is up to you. But as you can see, these are 3 different sections and they're all serving a purpose for the same organization. So use these things to your advantage. Definitely got the question about, how do you get committees up and moving? So committee structures, they're really going to determine the work that the organization is doing. So you understand what the organization needs to accomplish. And with that said, you are able to provide directions for your committees. You set the standard. Let me give you an example. So the board that I am the chair of, we have added ad hoc committees, which means that there are very specific things that we need to focus on because things have come up as a part of our strategic plan. These committees are brand new. Board members, some of the board members are new. They've never heard of this before. So what I did was I put a 30-minute time frame on the calendar. Those who said that they have interest in that particular committee, I jumped on a call with them and I made an introduction to those board members about what the committee is, what the expectation from my perspective is, and then I wanted to talk to them to make sure that what I was proposing made sense to them. So I was able to set the groundwork, have a discussion with that particular committee, and now I feel comfortable that everyone is clear about what the expectation is, and now they can go out and do the work. I'm not necessarily a helicopter leader where I have to be a part of every single step that they make. I feel like if they have to work with the folks on this committee, then they should be responsible for finding out who in the community would be a good fit for the committee. I want to be a part of it, but I also want to make sure that our committee members are empowered to bring the right people together so that they can accomplish the task at hand. Now, when we talk about identifying clear goals, if it's not written, it didn't happen. I hear that all the time. And I say that because usually nonprofit boards are volunteer positions. So if something were to happen and let's say the leader of a board or even one of the board members, individual contributors, they have to step away from the board for whatever reason, you need to make sure that things can still continue to move. And you're able to do that when you are documenting things appropriately. You also want to make sure before someone accepts the responsibility of being a board member, they really know what they're getting themselves into. So that's one of the reasons why having a board member job description is just as important. If you are working a 9-to-5, your career position, in order for you to find yourself interested in the position, to know if you have the right qualifications, you're looking at what? A position description. And that should be no different when you are looking for board members to fill these seats. Now, a part of that also is the board member agreement. All right, so we have someone who's interested in becoming a board member. They've accepted the nomination and now they move into the role of, okay, you've accepted the invitation to be a board member. Now, what are you agreeing to? This is more internal. What are you agreeing to? The board member agreement form, it is literally a written document that's setting the expectations for what the board is expecting from you, what the organization is expecting from you. And while this is not intended to be like a legally binding document, it should set an expectation of what the board member will be responsible for. And then we will move into governing documents. But I wanted to give you a very clear example of what a board member job description would look like. So this is an example of one from BoardSource, and I will reference BoardSource quite a bit because I use a lot of their documents and articles and things of that nature just to help me become more well-versed on some of the things that I could deal with my board. And when I'm giving presentations like this, making sure I'm providing the most accurate information. So a board member job description, as I mentioned, looks like any position description you would see. It provides expectations of the board as a whole and what you are expected to do as a board member. So individual board member expectations. And then they also give you some additional things that you should take into consideration if you are considering. At this point, you can still back out at this point because it's just like, well, you know, I didn't realize that it would be this much work. I don't know if I have the capacity to really give my best to this role. So we're giving you all of these things just to make sure that you are well aware of what you're getting yourself into. Now, let me give you an example of what a board member agreement form looks like. Now, these are just templates. You can add to it, take away from it. You can just set these up however you feel fit. It depends on what your board decides on. But I just want to show you what a sample could look like. So it's saying, like, as a board member of XYZ organization, this person is fully committed and dedicated to the mission. And they are signing on the dotted line that they are agreeing to carry out the mission, but they're also understanding what their duties and responsibilities are. And then you list the things that you are asking for them to do, being fiscally responsible, understanding the legal responsibilities. We talked about the duties of responsibility earlier in the presentation, accepting the bylaws and making sure that you're operating efficiently and effectively using those tools. And also this comes down to the financial donations. Like, I don't know what everyone's giving expectations are, but this would be a good place to put that as well. And then how actively engaged are you asking your board members to be? These are the documents where you should be very, very granular about what you're asking. If you're asking them to promote any activities or things of that nature, as long as there's not a conflict based on what their, what their career is, because sometimes there could be conflicts with folks who are like in the legal system, fundraising for an organization. So there are some conflicts in that way, but just make sure that you are very clear about the number of board meetings that they have to attend. What are your exemptions? How many phone calls, like how, things have changed a lot with being able to jump on Zoom or Teams. So be very specific in your bylaws so that they are aligned, like what you're asking them to agree to and what's in the bylaws. And so signing the document, once more, you're signing this. So you're saying that, you're very clear on what we're asking. And this will go into basically a personnel file. This is something that the secretary will hold on to make sure that all documents are lining up with each board member. And if there is, for whatever reason, any need to refer back to something, that should be on file. All right, so let's talk about governing documents. There are a few things that I want you all to keep in mind. And I consider these dominant governance documents. The organizational documents naturally are articles of incorporation. The federal, state, and our local government filings should be held actually at the organization. That's something that the executive director or CEO should have copies of. That's something that should be readily available if needed. Now, when it comes to numbers 2 through 5, these are governing documents that the board should heavily rely on. So the bylaws are very vague internal guidelines. They kind of give you a direction and a sense of how you should handle things. But policies give you really deep instructions. And these are more day-to-day operations. So the reason why bylaws are a little bit more vague is because it's harder, like it's not harder. I would just say that it takes more time to make a bylaw change as opposed to a policy change. So with a bylaw, you're not looking at just one bylaw as a part of several pages of this document. You have to consider the entire document when you go before your board asking for a bylaw to be adjusted. So the board has to agree to it and vote on it. Whereas a policy is not. A policy can be updated, for example, by the staff, like on the staff side of the house, from the executive director or CEO, and they can bring it to the attention of the board that the policies have been updated for X, Y, Z reason. Now, when we talk about conflict of interest, this is something that is seen in both places on my board. So you can see it in the bylaws, but you also see it on the board agreement form. So that's mentioned just to make sure if there's any conflict of interest for any reason, the conflict of interest form sets out the procedures that needs to take place just to make sure that you are staying clear of a conflict, or if a potential conflict arises, it kind of gives you just an idea of how do you handle that type of thing. And the strategic plan. This is like an amazing document that is extremely important. But you also have to make sure your board is at a place where a strategic plan is actually warranted, because sometimes there are things that need to be cleaned up before you can even get to a strategic plan. And I would say that's the organizational blueprint, and it sets the tone for where the organization intends to go. So what I'm referring to is, if you're at a place where you're not even fully organized, your bylaws are out of whack, you don't really have clear policies, then perhaps a strategic plan, you have not gotten to that point yet, because it could take a long time. We are just rolling out our strategic plan, and it literally took us about a year to get it together. It was a lot of hands in the pot, making sure that we were connecting with the right people, having the right conversations, and steering in the direction that we all were in agreement with. Now we're moving to, how do you determine board structure? And so there was a question that came earlier. This is where we talk about defining diversity in terms of your board makeup. This will help you to determine what needs to happen. This will challenge the thought process of your board, board leaders, to help you really understand, how do you find the right people for your board? So I would start with regular board self-assessments. You need to be in touch with what's happening on your board from an internal perspective, and being able to regularly assess yourself is a good starting point. Now, when we talk about that, we move into, well, how do we assess ourselves? Well, there's a matrix, a board composition matrix, and I like to call it the ultimate wish list. This would basically say, who and what do we need to add value to both the board and the organization? So when we're talking about a composition matrix, we want to take an inventory of the experiences, the talents, the abilities, and the leadership characteristics that are needed for an effective board of directors. And also, the matrix can determine gaps in the board's composition. So this is what you need to really self-reflect on. Then when you get to the point of asking those questions and looking at the board matrix, and I'll show you what that looks like in just a second, these two questions should come into play. Does the board reflect the diversity of the community it serves? And how does the board define diversity? Diversity is a word that we hear all the time, but it could be defined differently by different people and different organizations. So collectively decide on what that means for you and your board. Let me show you what a composition matrix looks like. It is very detailed and it's broken down into many different categories. We're talking about from age, gender, qualities, financial resources, transgender, sexual orientation. These are all of the areas that sometimes we may not even think about paying attention to. But this board matrix gives you a very clear understanding of the type of diversity that exists and the things that we should pay attention to more than just, oh, well, how old are they? Are they Black and white or they their gender preferences? Like there's more things to understanding diversity. And I feel like this matrix does an excellent job of giving you a lot more options to take into consideration. So once you look at this, then you get to the next page, and then you are able to actually look at what your board currently is comprised of. And this will help you to identify those gaps that I was referring to. So right here on this second page, you go through every single person on your board answering all of these questions. That's what these numbers and letters are for. And by the time it's all said and done, when you're finished with this form, you will be able to see very clear gaps of what we're missing. Yep, see, community connections, qualities. This is such an excellent document. And Yenting is going to make sure that participants get, you receive the slide deck. So all of these are live links. So you will have more time to kind of peruse and read and get all the information you need. All right, so running an effective board meeting. I love it when I'm able to write something where it looks so simple, like, okay, to run an effective board meeting, all you need is an agenda. Yeah, that seems like very simple, but actually in most cases it is. So the question that I received, I'm going to be answering the following question, like, what is good governance? How to keep board members engaged and stay out of the weeds. This is how you do that. When you're running an effective board meeting, you have an agenda. An agenda is defined simply as a list of items to be discussed at a formal meeting. It keeps your ideas focused. You know exactly what you come there to accomplish. You know exactly what topics you want to talk about. And an agenda just keeps you on track to make sure, if at all costs, you can stay away from rabbit holing. And also, to run an effective board meeting, board members have to have the right materials. They have to have materials in enough time for them to take their time, read through it, and have an understanding of what's going to be discussed so that they can adequately contribute to the conversation. Meeting materials, reaching directors in a timely manner is a major part of how you are able to run an effective board meeting. So in addition to these two things, there has to be great facilitation. So the board chair is responsible for making sure that if certain conversations get a little too lengthy, you bring it back in. You can even add it to old business, and that's something you can come back to at the next meeting. Making sure that the conversations are aligned with long-term goals and focusing on the results. Stay focused, know exactly what the responsibility is and why do you need the board to have these very clear conversations, and use that to the advantage, especially as someone who's leading the board. Oh, let me show you an example of an agenda. This link actually has several different examples, but what I'm going to do is show you the one that is the simplest, very, very simple. And for the most part, this is what for the board that I'm leading, our agenda looks very much like this one. Let's see. Here we go. ABC nonprofit. There's 7 things on the agenda. It starts with calling the meeting to order, approving minutes from the last meeting, which should have already been sent out, the financial reports, because typically at every meeting, you need to give consistent updates on what the finances look like. The executive director talks about what he or she has been focused on, and perhaps lending, like asking the board, this is what I need assistance with from the board for the staff side of the house, for the day-to-day operations. And then what I don't see on here is usually committee reports. Like if there are, the program committee needs to give an update on what their committee meeting looked like. That's another thing. Committees meet separately from the actual executive board and the full board meetings. So work should be happening all the time. Committee members are the ones who are responsible for creating that flow, that consistent flow of work. And they choose their own time. They do whatever they need to do outside of these meetings, but when it's time for the meetings, they should be able to give a full report of what they accomplished, what they're currently working on, what type of support they need from the board. This is where you should get all that information. So, right, that's the only thing I would say is missing from here, committee reports. Then you have old business, like I mentioned. If something was becoming a little bit too lengthy in discussion at the last meeting, then push it to the next meeting so that you can continue to iron out those details and come to a solution at some point. And then new business, if there's something that's new that needs to be presented before the board, and then you adjourn until the next time. So now we're moving into section 5, purpose-driven leadership. That is the namesake for this webinar. So the Stanford Social Innovation Review, they wrote this article, The 4 Principles of Purpose-Driven Board Leadership. When I read this article, it really, really did something to the way that I thought about how to structure the board that I'm leading. So the first thing I need to do is define, what does this mean according to this article? So board service that operates in service to the organization's purpose and not to the organization itself is how purpose-driven leadership has been defined. Now, let's break it down even further. What does that mean? Like what that sound, these are beautiful words that have been put together, but what does that mean? So what's best for purpose and community, that does not always equate what's best for the organization. So when we talk about the 4 principles of purpose-driven leadership, it's important for us to dive deep into these 4 areas because they directly relate to the purpose-driven portion. So number 1 of the 4 principles, purpose before organization. So you want to prioritize the organization's purpose versus the organization itself. So here's a direct line that comes from the article. So applying the concept of purpose before organization, it moves away from the organization as the center of its own gravity, refocusing on its purpose and the question of how it can best steward its resources in service of that purpose. Then we move on to having respect for the ecosystem. What we have to understand as nonprofit organizations is that we are a part of, I would say, there are a lot of other players that go into effect and we should take consideration when we are creating a particular path from our organization itself. So the choices and the actions of an organization can positively or negatively impact the ecosystem or the community in which it intends to serve and be a part of. So I want to be clear about, you're serving the community, but you also have to consider yourself as part of the community. And with that said, what the respect for the ecosystem is doing, it's posing the question of how is your organization actually impacting the ecosystem? You know, are you doing what needs to be done to to close the gaps? Are you widening the gaps because you're doing things that are not necessarily eco-friendly? So when we talk about 3 and 4 of the 4 principles, we come to equity mindset. So equity mindset is building on the awareness that clearly in most cases, there are systematic inequities that we're constantly fighting against. And the organization is committing itself to advancing equity in everything it does. I mean, from who you bring onto your board, the things that you align yourself with, making sure that it's in aligned with your mission, but also that what you are actually providing as a product to the community is something that it's taken into consideration that you are working against the systemic inequities that exist. And then when we talk about authorized voice and power, what does that mean? So authorized voice and power is saying the organizational power and voice, it has to be authorized by the folks who you claim you're serving. Those who are impacted by organizational outcomes, it's their voice that you are speaking on behalf of. It's their concerns, it's their challenges, it's their needs, not the individual needs of those who are on the board or who are in the day-to-day grassroots, making sure that policies are carried out. It's bigger than that, and that has to be at the forefront of the work that we're doing. So that is the end of all of the informational pieces. But I wanted to go back because I feel like I didn't do a great job of when we talked about the committees. So one thing that I also wanted to talk to you about when it came to committees is how you can actually use them to your advantage to solicit new board members. So when you're asking people from the community to come and serve as a committee member, what you're doing is introducing them to your organization. They are then becoming ambassadors. Volunteers become ambassadors because they're sharing the work of your organization with their networks in the community. They're basically the liaison between the community and the organization, and you want to make sure that you are equipping them with the right idea of what you're doing, how you're holding true to the mission and the purpose of the organization, and how they can actually help with that. So if you have someone who's volunteered with your organization for several years, and there is a board position that becomes vacant, wouldn't you think about using that person or extending an offer for them to be on the board, especially if you're referring to the matrix, and the matrix is saying that this person has the leadership skills, or they actually have some of the experiences that we need to fill this position. Look to your volunteers, your liaisons for the organization, and folks who are on your advisory and steering committees. Make sure that they have the skills and abilities that line up, and they would be amazing potential candidates for board leadership. So keep that in mind. It's easier to vouch for someone who actually has a connection with the organization already. You don't have to teach them something that they've already been exposed to. So that was what I wanted to reiterate. So now I will move to the last slide where I talk about additional resources. I mentioned boardsource.org, my absolute favorite resource. They have everything you can imagine, from some of those templates that I showed you, the articles. They actually even have a board like where you could drop questions from other leaders and nonprofit board members or board leaders, and just kind of pick the brains of folks who are having some of the same challenges or could perhaps lend you some advice based on their experience. So very good resource. I use it all the time. I encourage you to take advantage of such a resource. So this is the article that I was referring to, Leading with Intent, the Board Source Index for Nonprofit Board Practices. Well, let's talk about that first. So there is a report that comes out, and there are actually two reports. So one is the Leading with Intent. It gives a compilation of boards across the United States. And it takes a lot, like it asks a lot of questions. And so you get to see the results of some of those questions, like key findings. So it's almost like a study where they resource information from a variety of different types of nonprofits. And they put it all in this very well documented article. And I would say it's like a resource packet. And it really can be helpful when you're trying to understand like some of the challenges that exist across the board. What are some of the resources to help you identify where you can find some assistance, honestly. So yeah, this one is the latest. This came out for 2021, and you should look for another one next year. And there's also another one, but this one is specifically talking about reviewing the state of diversity, equity, and inclusion of nonprofit boards. Another really, really well detailed document that could speak to some of the questions that you might have, talking about diversity goals and how can you address some of the challenges as it relates to diversity and equity through a very specific lens. It tells you what they found. It gives you some of the data that they've collected. Use these things to your advantage, because none of us were born with this level of knowledge. You had to experience it, learn it, read about it, study it. That's how you get better. That's how you become more sharp in your responsibilities. This is the article I was referring to. And if I'm not mistaken, I think I included that as a part of the sign up as well. So you should already have this, but this is the article itself. It goes into some amazing details when we're talking about those 4 principles. This is such a well-written article, and I just encourage you to take your time and read through it and use some of the things mentioned as you are really regrouping yourselves to make sure you're doing the best work. And then, of course, I would be remiss if I did not add Aparo Business and Tech Solutions for nonprofits, who have given us all this opportunity to learn and continue to grow as a nonprofit organization. And finally, this is how you find me. So like it, tag it, share it, tweet it, you know, all of the tweets, everything. I'm not on all social media, but I tried to pick 2, and I'd like to stay there. So you can find me on Instagram, LinkedIn, and then my website, and my email address is there. So this has been an awesome opportunity. We have about 12 minutes left for questions. Happy to take some now.
Thank you, Kendra. First of all, amazing presentation, such a wealth of information that you provided. Thank you. We did have a question come through in our Q&A. Because I often hear of boards referred to as working or governing. Can you clarify what a working board is and how that might be different than committee members?
So that's a really good question, Tanya. Thank you. When I think about working boards, it's not like a definition. I feel like it's a slang a lot of times that's associated with a board, because, you know, there are some boards who board members are there by name, like, oh, okay, my name shows up as a board member, but I haven't actually done anything with the board or anything substantial. A working board means that your committees are actually doing what they're supposed to do. They're focused on the work. They're meeting when they're supposed to. They're giving really good updates. A working board basically means that I'm not just here taking up space. I'm actually working. The mission is important to me. I'm an ally in the community. I show up to events. I share information about what my board is doing. That's a working board. That means that you are very much engaged in what's happening. You show up, you ask the right questions because you care about the information, and you challenge. And I'm saying that again, you challenge the thought systems and some of the activities and the things that the nonprofit is providing, and even the organization as well. So I think that working board is Yes, I call it a slang a term of endearment. When people say, yeah, I'm on a working board, because they work me. I actually do what I'm supposed to do, and they hold me responsible for the skills and abilities that I bring to the table. I hope that answers your question.
In kind of the same vein, there was a question that came up in the registration. What are the practices that differ from perhaps a new startup board than an established board?
So the new board, those things that I was talking about by clearly defining the roles, making sure that your bylaws are something that is a responsible document to help you govern the board. Those are the things in the beginning that need to be you should pay very close attention to making sure those basic things are where they need to be. A more established board, they're more at a top level where, not to say that the bylaws and the strategic plan, those things don't matter. They've gotten past all of that preliminary, those things, and they're really focusing on making sure they're adjusting their mission and the purpose to align with the changing needs of the community. Like, they're more focused on the actual work as opposed to the building blocks that would help to prepare them to better do the work.
If there are other questions, please pop them into either the chat or the Q&A. While you guys are doing that, perhaps you can answer another question about maybe resources or places where they can get board members trained.
Yeah, Anne-Marie said, Anne-Marie Warman, I forgot about BoardSource, and it's a really good resource since it's free. Let's say that again. Anne-Marie, it is free of charge. You have phenomenal resources out there that I will encourage you all to take full advantage of, because the resources are there because there is a level and a need for nonprofit boards to be successful. So please take full advantage of all of those resources.
Well, I think those are all the questions that have come through. We have a couple more minutes if we have any final questions, but Kendra, any final words before we officially wrap up this webinar?
No, I am grateful for the time that you put into making sure that this was a successful webinar. And I am sending kudos from South Carolina to all of my fellow board members and board leaders. The work it's not an easy task. It really isn't. But if you continue to find yourself engaged in these type conversations and chasing the resources out there, I think that we will all be better for it. You're not expected to know everything, but there is an expectation, because we have taken on this responsibility, for us to make sure that we take full advantage of how we can appropriately commit ourselves to the community.
Thank you. Very well said. And again, thank you for spending the time to put all of this great information together and being so willing to share your expertise.
Thank you.
For everyone else, thank you for attending. You will be getting a follow-up email from me by the end of the day tomorrow. Like I said, it'll include the link to the recording, the slide decks, and all of these wonderful links that have been provided for you today. If you have any questions for me, you can reply to that email. I'll be happy to answer from you. Other than that, thank you guys for attending and have a great rest of the day.
Thanks, Ying Ting.